Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. Just before we move into the session, I'm just going to do some general housekeeping, kind of standard Zoom rules. I'm sure we're all used to by now. But just so you know, you'll be able to see on screen now that this is a setup, so it's not a webinar where we're just viewing someone else's screen. So all of you are on screen and will be able to be seen and speak if you want to. So just to let you know, the session is being recorded and will be available to view on the SCVO YouTube afterwards. If you don't want to be recorded, do feel free to switch your camera off, but I have been assured by the events team that we will only be recording the speaker. So it will only be if you're speaking that your camera will show up, but do feel free to switch off your cameras if you wish to. We have over 100 people signed up for this today, so we just are asking for your help just in terms of helping us to make sure it runs smoothly just by doing the usual, like keeping yourself on mute. If you wish to ask a question, we ask that you either do so in the chat box, which my colleague Sally will be keeping an eye on, or if you can use the Zoom function to raise your hand, and we'll come to you as and when we can. If you are looking to be asking a question or inputting into discussion, just ask that you wait until we call you before you unmute and speak. Again, just to keep us with things running smoothly. So just to flag up that, as I said, some of my SCVO colleagues are here with us, so Sally will be keeping an eye on the chat, but also we have Christy McAlpine from Funding Scotland as well, who's been key in helping to getting this event set up. So just to let you know that she's here. Some of you will have seen that we've got the newly refreshed Funding Scotland website, which has just recently been launched. So if you've got any other queries, then do feel free to get in touch with Christy following the session, and she will happily answer any queries that you have. So I think that is all the housekeeping. So, the last thing is, if you do put your hand up using the Zoom function, then please remember to put your hand down if your question has either been answered or you decide you don't want to ask your question, etc. So, yes, I think that's everything housekeeping wise. So just to introduce us into the session, we know that there's been an ambition over the past few years around looking at changing the funding landscape and looking to the future of funding, creating more flexible and accessible funding and so on. And we've seen a lot of funders moving in that direction pre-pandemic. Obviously, we then saw a massive change with funders adapting and changing their ways of working within a matter of weeks in response to the pandemic. So really, as you'll have gathered from the title of this session and the information on registration, we're really looking to get an understanding now and start to learn and have discussion around post-pandemic or 12 months on from the beginning of the pandemic, what's been working really well, what's been valued, and what is realistic about what we can keep from that learning to create a new normal in the funding landscape, rather than necessarily just going back to the kind of pre-pandemic business as usual. So just to get a sense of who's in the room before we start to get our inputs from our guest speakers, we've got a few polling questions, which one of my colleagues is going to put on the screen in just a second. And we're just wanting to ask you to basically give us your votes, let us know who you are and what you think in response to those 3 questions, and that will help us to inform some of the discussion going forwards. So enough from me just now. I'm going to introduce you to our speakers. So we have Nick Addington, who is the Chief Executive of the William Grant Foundation, and we also have Carolyn Sowers, who is the Acting Chief Executive at Corra Foundation as well. And both of them are real leading lights in the funding sector, and have a real knowledge and interest in looking at learning and development in the funding community. So without further ado, Nick, I'm going to pass over to you to kick us off now.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you for inviting me to join the discussion today and for hosting this very timely meeting. It's certainly a topic that I think is very important, and I'm very interested to get into the detail, hopefully in the questions and answers and the discussion. I just wanted to offer some fairly sort of high level comments to begin with. I'll talk a little bit about the role of grant funding, the diversity of the funding scene and funders, hopefully reassure folk a little bit about the direction of travel in terms of moving towards perhaps more flexible funding practices. And I want to close just by sharing what I think is a great rallying cry for this moment as we discuss these topics. So to begin with, in terms of the role of grant funding, I sometimes like to remind people that according to SCVO's very helpful state of the sector statistics, if you add trust and foundation and lottery funding together, it contributes 9.5% of the income of the Scottish third sector, so less than 10%. And Carolyn and I are both here from independent funders, so I think it's interesting, how much attention gets given to that relatively small part of the sector's income. And it prompts us to think, what do we want grant funding and particularly independent funding to do for the sector? Because it's not really the fuel that drives social change. That's the people, the organizations, and all the other funding that comes into the sector to support what it does. So I sort of think that independent funding should play a role ideally, which is more about kind of being the oil that kind of lubricates the social sector to move in a sort of continuous progress towards hopefully social change and sustainable social change. And yet too often it sometimes feels that grant funding is the sticking point. It's the thing you have to get off the blocks, or it's the thing that prevents progress from moving forward. And sometimes perhaps funding practices have been a bit like putting grit in the oil of that kind of lubricant. So rather than actually helping things move forward and enabling the sector, it's sometimes a bit of a sticking point. And if we think about the diverse income that the sector has, it reminds us how diverse the third sector is, everything from universities and housing associations at one end to scout troops and village hall committees at the other. And grant funding, I think, plays a different role in different parts of that sector. And just as the sector is very diverse, funders are very diverse as well. Remember that most of them are charities. We actually, William Grant Foundation, aren't an independent charity, but most funders are charities in their own right. They have charitable objects, they have a particular operating model, and they have maybe their own theory of change about how they want their funding to make a difference in the world. And that does lead to different funding processes, different timescales, etc. And I think that we have to recognize that and be realistic about that. So I'm afraid one thing I'm saying is that I think as we sort of gaze into the hopefully sort of sunny post-pandemic future, I don't think we're seeing the holy grail emerge of a single funding application and a unified reporting form just yet. And in fact, I think that's probably not a realistic prospect. But there's certainly things that could change, and I'm a big advocate of shifting funding practice towards being more open, trusting, and flexible. And I want to just provide a bit of reassurance that I think the direction of travel, certainly amongst Scottish funders, in that direction has been very positive. And I was pleased to hear Emma kind of acknowledge that in her opening remarks. Pre-pandemic, there had been a lot going on, I think, in the UK trust and foundation sector and here in Scotland to try and support change that makes grant making as effective as possible in terms of supporting the sector and enabling that kind of continuous progress towards social change. So I'm thinking of things like, I can't remember when it was, maybe 10 years ago now, there was a piece of work called Harmonising Reporting that was initiated by the Scotland Funders Forum, looking at opportunities to reduce the burden on organisations of reporting back to funders. and some great work came out of that in terms of principles that funders in many cases have adopted and that funded organizations can use too. And I was involved a couple of years ago, or last year, in the run-up to last year, on a working group convened by the Association of Charitable Foundations as part of their Stronger Foundations initiative. And we were looking at funding practices in particular, and a report came out last year promoting ideas about how funders could reflect on their funding practices and think about changes they could make. And that was all before the pandemic. So I think be reassured that I think practice is changing. There's a willingness to try and ensure that funders are fulfilling their own charitable missions as effectively as possible. And I'm seeing encouraging developments in terms of some of the new programs and funds that are being launched just now. Had a conversation this morning with one of our grantees, and she was able to talk about 4 funders who've given her unrestricted funding in the last year, and noted that that felt like a change from before. So I think you'll find in Scotland in particular that funders are willing to consider and reflect on funding practices and are really open to listening to the sector on that. And I think this is a time for for organizations that apply to funders and receive funding from funders to be assertive and to get involved in this discussion about how things could change. And I think we are seeing this in the UK in other fields. So for example, there's the movement Charity So White, which is really advocating for shifts in terms of diversity and equity and inclusion in the sector, including in the funding sector. And I think that those kind of movements are good things, and this is an opportunity to challenge poor practice, make suggestions of good practice, be open with your funders about what you think they could do better. And I think you'll find you'll get a receptive audience, I'd like to think. So I want to close with one of the quotes that I came across recently, which has really inspired me, and I think sort of sums up, if you like, the kind of vision of where I hope we can get to in terms of how funding works for the sector. I read it in an article I was reading about US philanthropy, particularly around funding the movement for racial justice in the States. And it's a phrase that was coined by a lady called Ashley Henderson from the Highlander Center in Tennessee, and she's involved in organizing for racial justice in that part of the world. And her slogan is, fund us. It's a challenge for funders. Fund us like you want us to win. And I think that's a great way of thinking about how we want to make funding work for the sector and try and take away barriers that potentially impede the kind of sustainable and continuing change towards the social progress that we're all here to see. Thank you.
That's great. That's really interesting and thought-provoking. Thanks, Nick. What I'll do is, if you have any questions for Nick, if you hold them just now, and we'll have the input from Carolyn, and then we'll look at moving into some discussion following Carolyn's input. So Carolyn, handing over to you now.
Thank you. Thanks, Emma, and thanks to SCVO for organising, and just as Nick said, for taking the moment, of this quite important discussion at this time. I've got the canny privilege of following Nick in my input, so I get to start with the immortal lines. I agree with Nick. It was beautifully put. I think they are the perspective and the lens that many funders in Scotland are looking through. We've got a set of funders in Scotland who are listening and trying very hard to do the right thing, all on a journey to doing so. And kind of what a journey it's been over the last year, a journey, with you, our partners across the third sector, with SCVO and kind of others. And I've got 3 things that I wanted to pick out that I think have been good about the last year in terms of the way that funding's worked over the last year, and also 3 things I thought I might just touch on that might have been right for this year, but probably need to change or be adjusted for the year ahead. So 3 things I think have been quite good, and we should probably keep going. And Nick's touched on the first of those already, which is more unrestricted funding. So it does feel to me like that's a general trend in the sector anyway, but we have seen lots of funders change their grants over the last year from restricted to unrestricted, and actually plenty of unrestricted funding going out from the Scottish Government, for example, as well. And that meant grants were made more quickly than they would have been otherwise, and that as kind of needs and the challenges changed on the ground, the funds were able to be used really flexibly. to be honest, I don't know if we'll ever need to see that kind of breakneck pace of response on the ground again. In many ways, I hope we won't, but I do know that unrestricted funding, regardless, is just hugely valuable to organisations, and it's perfectly possible for many funders to fund in that way. And so from my perspective, it would be a good thing as we look across the funding landscape if there were more unrestricted funding available to organisations. And for ourselves at Corra, for example, we shifted in the last year our kind of main small grants programme, Henry Duncan grants, to 5-year as unrestricted as possible. So the second thing that I think we should, from the last year, we should keep going as partnerships between funders. The last year saw a lot of partnerships between funders and sector organisations like SCVO and the TSIs. What I liked about this was, first off, it's kind of hugely practical. So there was a lot in the last year that involved people phoning each other up and saying, could you make grants to these organisations in the next 2 weeks? You know, so just fantastically practical kinds of partnerships and joint working. It was easier than we thought. So actually funders work on similar systems and they often work in similar ways. And over the last year, focusing on, in a sense, what we have in common rather than what's different about funding processes has really been immensely helpful and helped that kind of partnership. And the third thing that was good about that partnership between funders is that it's really achieved something. If you look at, for example, the Wellbeing Fund with kind of huge amount of Scottish Government funding flowing out into the sector, there was no one funder in Scotland that had the capacity to assess all the hundreds of applications to that fund. But what we did was combined our staff resources. We had immense help from the TSIs, and SCVO knocked the ball out the park, building a shared system that meant that dozens of different staff and different organisations were all working on the same programme. Egos at the door, credit not necessary, because ultimately this was about flowing funding to people, communities, organisations who were doing the hard work on the ground. And the third thing that I think it's worth keeping from the last year is about sharing risk. And it strikes me that one of our kind of limitations on our sense of what's possible is really about our understanding of risk and who holds it. And I reflect on the last year, and I think what happened during the pandemic was that we saw what was possible when I suppose the risk of not acting was greater than the risk of acting. And that makes me think now, I wonder how we can take that perspective into our future challenges. So if we don't act to change systems that don't work well now, systems like housing, systems like the care system, what greater harms would result? If we don't act to tackle inequality, discrimination, the climate emergency, so what's the risk of not acting compared to the risk of acting? So just to look at the other side of that coin, 3 things that I think were really useful in the last year, but we probably need to develop them into something different now. So the last year for me in terms of funding seen a really strong focus on basic financial viability, getting organisations through. That was a big discussion between funders and between government and funders, and funding flowed really quickly to organisations that really needed it. We saw some scary bank accounts and we saw organisations just devastated by having to close the doors on the footfall, the activities, the sales that sustained them. And I think collectively we can be quite proud that there were actually far fewer closures of organisations and fewer redundancies in the sector than many had feared. But for me, funding needs to shift now to building much long-term financially resilient organisations. And in fact, programmes like Adapt and Thrive are now beginning to do that, because it brings into play, I think, a much wider look at the funding landscape and an acknowledgement that time-limited project funding, that delivering less than cost procured services, those ways of funding the third sector really don't help build reserves or the kind of financial flexibility that organisations would need to weather a storm in the future. 2 other quick things that I think we were valuable in the last year, but perhaps we need to rethink now. The second is relying on existing relationships. So to get money moving really quickly in the last year, one tool that funders like ourselves and partners used to distribute Scottish Government funding was to offer grants to existing grantees or to take nominations from TSIs and others. And in fact, we made 2,000 grants of £2,000 in this way. So very fast, very light touch, reached hundreds of communities and supported some great work. And of course, it wasn't the only way that funding was distributed. Actually, I was thinking about it across the last year. Corra's probably funded more organisations that were new to us than ever before, and loads of new start organisations who sprung up in response to the pandemic also accessed funding. But that idea of kind of existing relationships was important, and a question we at Corra also asked during the year was, who is this focus on trusted relationships missing out? And what we learned is that this kind of relationship-based approach, it's only as good as your relationships to start with, isn't it? You know, and indeed open grant programmes that feel fair, they're only as good as the accessibility and the reach of the information about them. So we took steps during the year, and will continue to take steps to reach out to and bring into specific funding programmes Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, you know, groups who were of course being really hard hit by the pandemic and by the fallout from George Floyd's death. So if trust and relationships is really vital, then I think the challenge is that funders need to consciously and continuously challenge ourselves on the diversity of our connections. And then my last one, focusing on the here and now, has been absolutely vital in the last year. There's been lots of short-term, fast spend money in the last year. Emergency support, it supported, you know, fantastic support and services for people, a huge digital transformation in the sector, and it helped the sector operate safely at a very difficult time. And there might be a push for some of this kind of short-term help again, you know, particularly as we look ahead to furlough ending. It's going to bring some tough times, some difficult choices. I think the discussion now, probably between the sector, funders and government even, should also be about how do we take the chance to build a stronger funding landscape that has a diversity of offer, a diversity of access, and more long-term unrestricted funding that really helps people and communities, the organisations that support them, work together on the long-term challenges that Scotland faces. So those are my ideas, and I'm incredibly keen to hear everyone else's.
Great, thanks so much, Carolyn. That was really interesting. I've been scribbling away lots of notes on both what you've said yourself and what Nick has said as well. And just before we kind of plunge into discussion, thank you to all of you who have filled in the poll for us. That's really helpful and really interesting. So just a quick overview of what we've learned from that already, that we've got in the room, 14% of our attendees are funders or funding organisations, and 86% are voluntary organisations. Now, I'm aware that there are some people in the room who probably fit into neither of those categories. So I know that there may be some of you who are thinking that I'm not one of those, but do give us a shout if you in the chat box if you particularly want us to be aware of, you know, what your other category is as such. So we also, on the second question we asked, did you feel that there was greater trust between funders and voluntary organisations during the emergency pandemic response? And I think that fits in really nicely with some of what both Nick and Carolyn were saying there as well about their experiences and what the learning has been so far. And it's really nice to see reflected in the poll results that 58% of respondents said that they definitely felt there was greater trust, 38% said somewhat, and 5% said no. So overwhelmingly there does seem to be a real trend to feeling that the response to the pandemic by funders and the relationships that they're building with community organisations has really been felt, and it's really built that trust, which is good to see, and we hope to see continue. And finally, the third question was, did you establish any new partnerships with other organisations during the pandemic? And again, similar to what Carolyn was touching on there at the end about, you know, not at the end, sorry, in your three good things, Carolyn, you know, there was a real element of establishing new partnerships, and we just wanted to get a sense of what that was like widely in the sector with our attendees today. So we've got 73% of people who responded saying yes, they did establish new partnerships during the pandemic, and 28% didn't. So some really interesting stats there, and very apt in terms of what both Carolyn and Nick have touched on there. So let me just check if there's any hands up. No. So what we'll do is I am now given the number of people in the room to help us manage the discussion and make things easy for everybody. I'm now going to do my best David Dimbleby and actually go out to some of our attendees who have asked questions when they were registering. So first up, I'm going to go to Archie Lowe from Grassroots Clothing to ask his question.
Hi everybody. I did actually write my question a couple of weeks ago, and I think some of it might have been answered by the speakers this afternoon, but it starts like emergency and crisis funds appeared that never existed before, and the processes seemed so much simplified for all, and the turnaround and processing was much quicker. So is this a style and approach that can remain for future funding systems, or do you think we'll actually go back to like the old system before pre-COVID and make it more long-winded and less accessible for people to apply for funding?
Thanks, Archie. Carolyn or Nick, do you want to start our discussion off?
Shall I go first, Nick? Oh, we're doing that thing where we unmute at the same time. I'll kick off, and I'm sure you have things to add. I mean, thanks for the question, Archie. I think you're right. I think we've both, reflected on that very issue. It was in our minds as well, coming to the session. And I suppose the simple answer is yes, maybe yes but, or yes and. I suppose I think this is where it's vital that funded organisations have their say and pick out and reflect back to funders, with strong voices, what it was about what worked in the last year that should be held on to, because we probably want to keep some of it, but not all. I mean, personally, I think one of the biggest positives was the paring down of application questions. I think you kind of touched on it in your question. A real rigor to say, if we're not going to do anything with that question, with that information, don't ask it. I think the speed of decision making really met the moment. I suppose as a funder, be honest and say what achieved that speed of decision making was some pretty unbelievable effort and round the clock working, and it felt like a sprint that lasted 8 months. So there's a question about how we turn that practice into, we can't turn a sprint into a marathon, so how do we turn that practice into kind of every day? And I think there's lots to be really proud of in some of the emergency fund stuff, but honestly, we did end up with different funds, different timelines. Some people ended up feeling that they kind of fell between funds, and because things were working at pace, they didn't have time to get really great advice and support. So I would reflect on the positivity of clarity about what funding's for, and kind of real momentum and drive to make decisions quickly. But would add to that, a kind of recognition that really short closing dates and really short time periods to spend money probably don't lend themselves to the kind of longer term social change that we're looking for in the years ahead.
Yeah, I think I'll just certainly agree with Carolyn's comments. I think that the situation last year meant that there was a strong alignment amongst funders in terms of what the role of their funding needed to be at that time, which was around, meeting immediate needs within people, families and communities, and sustaining organizations and helping to keep the lights on and then adapt. So that allowed for a great deal of the sort of collaborative working that Carolyn mentioned in terms of some of the kind of emergency funds that appeared. And I think longer term, we have to recognize that, as I sort of said in my opening remarks, that I think the role people will see for their funding will begin to diverge as they kind of think about the long-term way that they can make a difference within their particular sort of area of interest. And so the style of grant making will change to reflect that. However, I think that's something we're moving towards, but we're not there yet. And I don't think this crisis is over yet. I personally am not sitting back, relaxing too much about how this year might pan out. And I think it's important that we are prepared to be responsive if we need to going forward. And I think encouragingly, to mention Association of Charitable Foundations, again, they surveyed their members recently and published a report last week called Rising to the Challenge, which indicated that 84% of the respondents to that survey said that they were planning to maintain elements of the sort of flexibility in terms of payments and reporting that they'd introduced last year through 2021, and 86% were going to either maintain their level of giving or increase it. So I think that's reassuring in terms of continuing to sort of manage through this current period of crisis. But I personally, William Grant Foundation weren't personally involved in a lot of those kind of really collaborative emergency efforts that Corra and others were involved in, and I am only in awe of the amount of work that went into that. So I think we need to be mindful, just as the sector is really, people in the sector have really been affected by the challenges of the last year and are feeling quite exhausted after it. We need to recognise that's true for funders as well in some cases.
Great, thanks both. And I think, yeah, that's again some really interesting points you've made there, and really interesting to hear that statistic from the ACF Rising to the Challenge report. And it's really positive to hear that funders are in, a large number of funders are intending to continue that flexible approach. I think, as you say, Nick, I think we could be very quick to assume that we're coming out the other side of the pandemic, but we all know that there's various other things on the horizon, such as furlough ending, that may throw up and will throw up its own challenges as well, which that there might be a role for funders to play in that. Has anybody else, I'm just going to throw it out to everybody else, does anybody else have any comments or points that they want to make on the lines of Archie's question there, or building on what Nick and Carolyn have said there? Just, okay. Looks like not at the moment. So what we'll do is we'll move on and then into the next question. So this time I'm going to go to Katrina McAllister from the Venture Trust.
Hi everyone. I think it's kind of the same as Archie's. My question might have been slightly touched upon before, but it's kind of around the way that we can avoid returning to the old normal. I think this last year has really highlighted, as we've had to adapt a lot of the flaws in our systems and structures and our practices, especially around criminal justice work, which is what a lot of venture trust work is based on. And so as we move forward, how do we keep this new learning in our practices and not just go back to our old normal?
Great, Nick.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's good to ask not just about kind of what we've learned and seen that's been different in terms of how we've responded as funders, but actually how we've responded to issues like homelessness, for example, over the pandemic, and demonstrated that radical things can happen and change can be achieved, and what does that mean for the future? And I think we hopefully are more aware, perhaps because of the pandemic, of the nature of crises that affect society in the UK and further afield, and the climate crisis is something that I think we need to be very aware of as well. And we have demonstrated that we can respond to crises, and actually do in many cases things that we've known for a long time needed to be done, but we've just never found the ability to do before. So I think it's a good challenge to make. And I think I suppose from my perspective as a funder, in terms of thinking about how to try and support some of that continued implementation of things that we know need to be done, and as Carolyn said, the cost of not doing will be great, is around thinking about supporting work that supports the ability of organizations within sectors to work together. So that could be around networks, it could be around infrastructure, and support collaborative working. And I think often there's a call from funders for charities to work together collaboratively without really investing in their capacity to do that well, because that's not just about having a part-time post doing a project over here. It's about the core ability of the organization to be able to spot opportunities, build networks, take learning from others, share learning with others, and participate in collaborative initiatives. And so I think as a funder, I'm sort of conscious of thinking about, we need to fund organizations to be able to do that kind of collaborative work, both as individual organizations and as networks. And there's a need, I think, to continue to support the advocacy and the voice that's been given to a lot of communities through the pandemic. I've been very impressed by some charities that have sought very assiduously to make sure that they are close to the ground in terms of what's happening within their communities or within their particular sectors, and making sure that the issues are, as they are being experienced, are being shared with others and decision makers. So I think as funders, we need to think about how we support that kind of advocacy and influencing and policy work as well. I'll stop there and let Carolyn come in.
Oh, thanks, Nick. I think we're going to reflect similar points, and actually that point you've just made about capacity for partnership and funders understanding that is in the chat and the conversation there. So it obviously kind of picks up on points people are echoing in their own reflections of their own experience. And I mean, I think overall, this is a pretty wise question, isn't it? That with the the popularity of that, like hashtag Build Back Better. I mean, in Corra, we've been trying to use that alternative, like Build Forward Better. And I don't know if that chimes with people, but the idea behind that was, I think it is similar to your question, Katrina, because it's kind of like built back didn't really work for lots of people. So let's not recreate that old normal, as you've said. And I suppose I've got a couple of points that stand out for me that from the last year and that link to that. And the first is that what we've seen is that people stand up to help others in their community, but they also see that there are deeper and more systemic changes that are needed. We've been involved in this wonderful piece of work called Together We Help, which is peer research that's been mapping communities' responses to the pandemic. I really recommend a read, not just to read the stories of what people have done, which is remarkable, but also it kind of, for me, it's important to read it and kind of realise, let's not get too rose tinted about that great wave of social action that happened last year, because actually there's also anger in that report. There's anger about stigma of seeking help was reduced because everyone was seeking help, but actually that social action was needed because of underlying issues of poverty, of inequality, people's isolation, was a result of underfunded social care, issues that are long-standing and kind of not about the pandemic, although they've been exacerbated by the pandemic. And the second learning point that links to this kind of old normal thing for me is that I think we've seen in the last year that like power really is the heart of the matter, isn't it? And we know that we see the difference that is made when people's voices are heard, and when their ability to bring about change is kind of really strengthened. So we've also seen the power of the government in the last year, that kind of ability of a government to say, let's just pay everyone's salary in this sector because this sector has to close. Let's bring every person who's sleeping rough into a hotel. I mean, those are powerful things that that governments have done. We've also seen the limitations of the government's power. You saw how local authorities actually struggled to reach the most vulnerable in communities, and they embraced, in many cases, working with the third sector to do that. So I kind of think communities have had that taste of power now, and I hope in Scotland we've made quite a sort of irreversible step in policy making as well, so that that the voices of those who are living through these experiences must be heard, and to kind of bring out a kind of popular phrase that kind of nothing about us without us is for us. For grant making, certainly for Corra and perhaps others, that means that we are on, because of that experience, on a journey now to a much more participatory form of grant making. And we've been really proud this year, despite not being able to be in the room with anyone at the same time, to actually have been working with panels of people with lived experience of a range of different issues to make better grants built on their insights. And I think that's one way in which we shouldn't go back to the old normal in terms of funding. And we, as funders, I think there is a journey towards stronger recognition of lived experience of the issues that we're working to address, and to adopt and really promote more participatory forms of grant making as a result of that.
Great, thank you so much both. Again, loads of really interesting responses to that, and I agree. I think it's a really important question to, and I think it's, as a sector, we need to continue to ask that question. And I really like that the Corra phrase of the build forward better. I think that really says it all, doesn't it, about not going back, but actually what does the future look like for the community and voluntary sector and the funding sector, and both combined and more widely, as you say. There's been some really interesting discussion going on in the chat while you've both been speaking, and let me just come up to it. So on the point of partnership working and collaboration, which you were both talking about there, there's some discussion about actually the challenges that poses to organisations. It's great to be able to do, but actually takes a huge amount of work from organisations. And actually it would be really interesting and useful if there was an online portal or some way of facilitating that piece of work around joining organisations up and supporting them to reach organisations that are working in similar ways as well. So yeah, lots of really interesting stuff coming out around that. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that or add anything into that, but I thought, yeah, really nice information and chat going on there alongside. Great. Okie doke. We will move on then to our final question from the floor at the moment, and I'm going to pass over to Norrie Murray from SAMH, who was actually one of the individuals who was talking about that collaboration kind of tool, I suppose, as well. So it might be interesting as well, Norrie, if you have any thoughts on that you want to add.
Well, hello everybody. Good to see you virtually. The collaboration point, really what I was thinking there is, I've seen sometimes in the past a funder say, here's a new grants programme and we would really like to see some partnership working in any applications. It would be, the thing is, you don't really know who else is interested in that particular funding programme. So if there was just a wee simple place online, you could go and register an interest, perhaps say, well, we could offer this in a funding partnership. It would be a really easy and helpful way to facilitate partnership applications. And I think the other point I would make as well is sometimes, I've seen windows of like 6 or 7 weeks in funding programmes, and it really is quite difficult to pull together partnership applications in such a short period of time. And it usually takes you a couple of weeks to get in touch with a potential partner. So anyway, that was just an idea. The other question that I've got, and I just want to preface saying this is an individual question, I'm not talking on behalf of my organisation. So the question is, more funders are introducing income ceilings for applicants, thus targeting the resources at small, medium-sized organisations. Is there evidence that this approach produces the best outcomes for the intended beneficiaries of a grant or award? And also, does this approach also limit action at scale, for example, on a national level, which may be an effective response to meeting need, given the expected reduction in, for example, public funding?
Sorry, just did the classic on mute trying to speak there. Thanks so much for that, Nori. That's really interesting, and yeah, really helpful to get that bit of context as well around what you were talking about in terms of partnerships. In terms of the income ceiling income ceiling question, I've got applications on the mind clearly. Nick or Carolyn, do you want to come in and again kick us off in the discussion on that?
I'll kick off if you like. I think someone's already said it in the chat, Nori, but it's a great question. It's a toughie as well. I mean, I think that, again, just to be, Nick and I are here to do our best to answer questions, but please pose the toughies at us as well, because I certainly don't have all the answers. And as you were speaking there, what I was thinking was I don't think I've tracked that trend. So I don't have a kind of like a quantification of it to really aid my understanding, but I think it's worth tracking. And Emma mentioned question time earlier. I think this is one of those classic ones where it'd be nice to hear from the panel, and then it'd be nice to hear from Nori at the end, because I would like to know what's behind that question and what your views are, Nori, and of course others as well who are here. It feels to me like there might be plenty of both kinds of opportunities for those kinds of work, but I think it is worth tracking that trend. What I do see, I suppose, is an increased focus on work that's led by people who are directly experiencing issues. I suppose kind of back to kind of my previous contribution, and to that idea that communities as a first off will be directly responding to that, and there's a desire to, on the part of funders, I think, to back that community level work, which does mean, as a consequence, perhaps a natural kind of focusing in on community-based, smaller scale groups or kind of grassroots funding. And I think if one of the things that funders are hoping to do, which is certainly true of Corra as a funder, is strengthen the power of people and communities, and kind of use their resources to bring about the kind of changes that communities want to see, then there is something natural about focusing on kind of grassroots groups, and that will achieve good outcomes in those terms. I suppose focusing on the thing about income thresholds in the third sector is, like say you focus on organisations with less than 100k as a kind of income, that's still like 80% of the sector, isn't it? So I don't know, SCVO colleagues will know for certain, but it's a kind of very small number of organisations in the third sector in Scotland who are kind of below that, above that £1 million mark, like 5% or something like that. So when we think about income thresholds, I think it's a kind of complex environment with that massive grassroots and third sector organisations that are really micro in many terms. I suppose I suspect what's important in kind of focusing on funders' support is to kind of think about, in a sense, how do grassroots, local and national organisations work together on the biggest issues. And so I'm quite attracted to models that are about looking at the big challenges, but thinking about different tools in the toolbox to try and achieve those challenges. So, a major national project for me will always have a place alongside perhaps grants to, all kinds of diverse grassroots groups, all trying to achieve a kind of bigger change. If we think about some of the challenges ahead, like the climate emergency, it seems sensible to me to kind of have all of the tools in our toolbox around that and have the potential for action at scale, but action on the ground that builds to a scale as well.
Yeah, I really don't have a lot to add to what Carolyn's already said, which I think's been a really good answer. I mean, I would agree that I think that if a funder has a particular interest in building community capacity, social capital kind of at the grassroots, then there is a presumption that that's often going to involve smaller organizations, and being clear about that up front. If a larger applicant would be unsuccessful, then it's probably helpful to be clear about that in terms of eligibility criteria. But if they have a particular interest in an issue affecting communities more generally, then it's good to be thinking about, as precisely as Carolyn said, the different options. And I mean, I know, well, I'm not speaking for the Robertson Trust, of course, no connection to them, but I know that they have an income cap on their current programs, but they are actively looking at an offer for larger organizations, I think, with precisely that kind of view in terms of, sort of twin track approach, which I think makes a great deal of sense.
Great, thanks, Carolyn and Nick. Riddle, you have your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yes, yeah, it was a question. I mean, both the speakers ended their initial introduction reflecting on the position of Black minority ethnic people within the third sector. Nick referenced charities are wide, and also looking at our experiences. I'm a minority ethnic woman myself, and I work for Forth Valley Rape Crisis Center. This is a very individual question. So just if you could expand on how you intend to increase diversity as well as enable minority ethnic led organizations and community groups to access funding, that would be very helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Riddle. I've got, I have to be open and say that for the foundation I work for, the William Grant Foundation, we're at quite an early stage in terms of this topic. Interestingly, we're a family-governed foundation, so that has implications in terms of how decisions get made. It certainly doesn't mean it's impossible to increase the diversity of people involved in the process that leads to that. And I think we've got opportunities to learn about how that could look. We have, as a very first step, and we've done it in a quite crude way, but we have, as a very first step, we've been inspired by a coalition of funders who are looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion within the sort of foundation sector, and they have developed a kind of audit tool to look at where their funding is going and has gone, both in terms of the people that benefit from it and the organizations that receive funding, whether they're led by representatives of minoritized communities. So we have done a very quick and dirty kind of analysis of our grant making historically in terms of the destination of our funding and how that maps onto different sort of Scottish population in terms of proportions of diversity. But we recognize that's a pretty crude way of looking at it, but it is beginning, it provides us a starting point to start talking about that internally. And I think it's a useful tool as a starting point. So I'll confess that, I think we're quite an early stage, and I think probably in the sort of foundation sector in the UK, that's probably true of a lot of organizations, but it's something that we're thinking about and open to learning about.
Thanks, Nick. Carolyn, do you want to answer as well?
It's a great question. I'm so glad you asked it, and it reflects some of the same points that Nick has made about an acknowledgement of commitment and to learning and to a journey on this. And for Corra Foundation, I'll talk about our story over the last year. It's been particularly affected by and strongly influenced by our commitment as a whole staff team and a trustee team and an organisation to be becoming an anti-racist organisation. That's been an incredibly powerful driver for us actually as an organisation over the last year, and we've done that through a number of steps, as you would expect, looking at our own personal learning and understanding of racism, looking at who works in Corra and who governs Corra, looking at where does the money go, and both what communities does it reach and benefit, and who runs those organisations. And we're taking steps that include looking at our, what you might call our mainstream grant making. So, how do we ensure that is accessible to and reaches out to? So quite a change in our outreach approach, looking at our criteria and our materials. But also we've been really passionate actually this year about working on specific initiatives that are designed to make sure that we are listening to and responding to the needs of Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. We've been working with an organisation called Stewart Investors, who donated some funds to us and enabled us to work alongside communities, a community of Bengali women, a traveller community, young refugees actually in Glasgow. So working with them on community level grant making, they're identifying their priorities, and Corra's there just lending a bit of support and lending some resources along the way. And we've taken that work and are using that now to provide a driver to a wider approach around diversity, equity and inclusion that's been quite strongly informed actually by ACF's work on this. ACF have got a few good mentions today in this session. I'm so glad Max Rutherford's here lurking away on the session, but I think that's it's important then for us to look much more widely as a foundation at our overall approach to diversity, equity and inclusion, and to set ourselves some big challenges to again to work alongside all communities and to ensure that we are supporting the kind of journey that communities want to take as well.
Thanks to you both for that, and I'm aware that we've just got a few minutes left to go. I had hoped that I would be able to come back to both Mridul and Nori for some kind of follow-up on whether or not, as you say, question time style, Carolyn, on what your thoughts were on those responses. So what we'd ask you to do is, as we're just about to finish up, if you could pop any thoughts in the chat box for us, and any follow-up questions or queries, that would be really useful, and extending that out to everybody in attendance as well. I think we're getting to the point that we're wrapping up the session, but we're only really just starting to get into the real meat and interesting stuff in the discussion. I'm sure we could talk for hours about funding and learning for the future in a huge number of different ways. So this, really is just the start, I think, of some really interesting discussions around this. So do feel free to put thoughts, questions, queries in the chat, and we'll look at gathering that information and utilising that going forward for some follow-up work. On that, really just to say, as a reminder that funding is a priority in all its guises for SCVO. So if you have enjoyed this session and you're interested, then just keep an eye on what we're doing going forward and for opportunities to get involved with that as well. So lastly, a couple of things just to say thank you so much to Carolyn and Nick for your input and your really helpful thoughts and insights as well. And I just noticed as well in the chat, I think it's really nice just to highlight that somebody had said to say thank you to funders for their quick responses. So a real feeling of I think understanding of the massive changes that funders have adapted to in the past 12 months as well, but there's so much learning to come out of this. So just a couple of points to highlight before we finish up. Nick is chairing another event next week, a webinar about charity reserves, which has again been hosted by SCVO. So if you're interested in that, then do head over to the website and sign up. And finally, the SCVO Charity Awards have opened, as some of you might have seen yesterday, and there's some new categories there reflecting what the sector has adapted to how it's looked in all its different forms, and a recognition of all of the massive input of the sector in response to the pandemic. So do head on over to the SCVO website and get nominating for the charity awards. So all that's left to say now is just thank you to you all for coming along, and we look forward to seeing you again in future.